Hi everybody, and welcome to this session exploring the women of Anne Lister's journals. Anne, as we know, had many relationships, some pretty well known, others a lot less. So let's basically explore them together and lift up these women as their own complex and independent individuals with their own stories. We have a range of amazing speakers in this session, which are Jude Dobson, Chantel Smith, Steph Galloway, Amanda Price, Helena Whitred, Cat Williams, and Jane Kendall. And they're going to be talking about Eliza Raine, Isabella Norcliffe, Mary Vallance, Frances Pickford, Sibella Maclean, Maria Barlow, Madame de Rosny, and Vere Hobart. So we have 5 minutes per woman, so that's a pretty tight schedule, but there will be time at the end, about 10 minutes for questions. So if you want to leave your questions in the Q&A box below while we're talking about these women, then feel free. And so without further ado, because we're on a pretty tight schedule, we're going to start with Eliza Raine, presented by Jude.
Hi. Anne Lister's first girlfriend was Eliza Raine. She was born in Madras in India in 1791. She was the younger of 2 daughters. Eliza's father was William Raine, Esquire, an army surgeon in the service of the East India Company. Her mother was an Indian woman whose name does not seem to have been recorded. William Raine died in June 1800 on board the East India Company ship Asia. It was en route to Europe. Mr. Raine had made financial provision for his daughters in his will. His executor and friend, William Duffin, was to be their legal guardian. Mr. Duffin sailed to Madras to collect the 2 young girls and bring them back to England. This journey was under wind and sail. It would take 6 months. It wasn't until 1802 when the girls arrived in England, and Mr. Duffin enrolls them in a boarding school for foreign girls in London. 2 years later, the Raine sisters moved north to live in York with the Duffins. Jane is enrolled as a day pupil at Manor School in York, and Eliza as a boarder. Eliza shares an attic bedroom with fellow pupil Anne Lister. The 2 become friends and lovers, and they make it out because Anne is asked to leave whilst Eliza finishes her studies at the school. Eliza spends some school holidays with Anne's family in Halifax, so she gets to know her parents and siblings quite well. When Eliza leaves Halifax in August 1806, Anne starts keeping a record of their correspondence. It begins, Eliza left us. When Eliza finishes school in 1809, Anne and her mother collect her and inquire about Anne returning to complete her studies. Anne starts back at Manor School in 1810 and stays with the Duffins. Eliza goes to stay with her cousin Lady Crawford in Doncaster. She's unhappy there, so Anne supports her to move to Halifax and lodge with the school mistresses, the Miss Mellins. She subsequently rents her own house in Savile Row in Halifax. In the meantime, Anne is widening her choice of her circle of friends in York with the Norcliffes and the Belcombes. Eliza and Anne continue to write to one another, and in May 1811, Eliza writes, "You are my dearest Lister, one ever dear to my remembrance. I love you and enjoy you now only in retrospection. I believe I have attained that which prefers your happiness to my own, for though I must necessarily feel that a sad vacuum remains, yet I allow myself not to imagine I can be at all unhappy whilst you are so superlatively so." Things take a downturn for Eliza. She briefly moves to Bristol and then on to lodgings in York, but her relationship with the Duffins becomes strained as her mental health deteriorates. She's admitted temporarily to a private asylum in York in late 1814, and then again in 1815 for an extended period, before being discharged in early 1816. Only a few months later, Eliza is permanently committed to Clifton House under the care of Dr. William Belcombe. This is Mariana's father. The private asylum is relatively small and overlooks the village green. Anne records in a diary a couple of visits to see Eliza with Mr. Duffin. in December 1817. Over the following years, Anne maintains occasional contact with Eliza. She later reflects that she was the most beautiful girl she ever saw. Dr. Steph Belcom takes over from his father as proprietor of Clifton House Asylum. When he retires, he sells the house and Eliza moves to a private asylum in York. Next. The UK lunatic asylums. She is admitted to Terrace House in the village of Osbaldwick on the 10th of November 1853. This is under the care of Mrs. Elizabeth Toes. Terrace House is now called Stanley House. It's still standing and is grade 2 listed. Eliza lived there until she died on the 31st of December 1860. She was 69 and outlived Anne by 20 years. She left nearly £8,000 to the Treasury Department. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Duke. And now on to Chantal Smith with Isabella.
You're muted, Chantal.
Oh, yeah, Chantal.
I was hoping to go one day. Okay, so thanks. I've got Isabella Tibb, as we all know her, Norcliffe, and that is correct. Her middle name and last name are the same. So next. Isabella, or Tibb, I'll just say for the rest of this, born November 9th, 1785 in Langton Hall, which you can see here. This is a side shot where it looks out over the wold that you'll hear Anne talk about a lot in her journals. Tibb, as far as I found, goes by 2 different nicknames, Tibb, and then there's a letter from Mariana where she refers to Isabella as Belle. So we've got Tibb and Belle as her nicknames. And her name, being Isabella Norcliffe Dalton when she was born, was changed to Isabella Norcliffe when her father had to change his surname in order to inherit Langton Hall. So she was born with a different middle name and a different last name, but then had to go to Norcliffe later on. And I've got a snippet of her handwriting because she talks about at one point that she doesn't like writing, but yet she has the prettiest handwriting of probably all of the letters that I've seen so far from the different people. So she's got a very artistic way of writing, even though she claims that she doesn't like it. Next. So she came from a pretty good sized family. So her dad was Thomas Norcliffe Dalton, and her mom was Anne Wilson. She was the first child of the 2 of them, and she had several brothers and sisters. A lot of you might be familiar with Charlotte. She comes into play multiple times in the journals. Charles Best, of course, married to her sister, Mary Norcliffe, and they had Rosamond and Mary Ellen Best, which a lot of you will know Mary Ellen Best. So that was Isabella's niece, was Mary Ellen Best. And then her brother, of course, Norcliffe, inherited Langton Hall. So eventually Langton Hall ended up in the hands of Rosamond Best after several of the family members died. But you can see she had several brothers and sisters, and her being the oldest, there's a lot of instances where we really get to see her personality come out over time. And Emily was the sister that did die, and it's pretty prominent in the beginning of the journals that we've seen a lot of transcriptions from, and was friends with Miss V, who of course Tibb was very good friends with Miss Vallance. Next. So I wanted to call out some things that kind of bring to light Isabella's personality, because that's one of the great things about her, is that she was very different from a lot of these, I don't want to call Mariana uptight, but Mariana was more, not so free as Tibb. So one of my favorite quotes was from M to Anne, and Anne calls this out in her journal, that in 1831, how disgusted she was with Tibb's shocking grossness yesterday. On saying Charles was going to Paris, Tibb had wished Mariana would take her with her up her arsehole and such like. So that was the kind of humor that Tibb had, which of course totally disgusted Mariana. But I think Tibb was one of the ones that was just very comfortable with being herself. At another point, she shaves her head because she thinks that it will grow back thicker and darker. So she shaves her head in 1823, or has her head shaved, and then starts wearing wigs while it grows out. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if she continued to shave it, but I wonder if it worked. That'll be interesting to find out. Anne makes comments about Tib really liked to sleep. So like in 1819, she mentions that Tib on the bed as usual, asleep all afternoon. So Tib, also an actress, she liked to play roles. She also puts on shows for people. So she's very flamboyant, likes to have a lot of fun. At one point, she uses the term pevy for Anne in a letter. And then there is a very interesting letter Mariana mentions in 1809 that her intended is in a convalescent state. So there is potential evidence that Tib was betrothed to a man, but that he died. So more interesting stuff there. Next. So she died May 11th, 1846 in York, and she's buried with her mom and Charlotte and her other siblings in West Tanfield, because that's where her family also owned property. So she's not actually at Langton. She's in West Tanfield if you would like to go visit her, because she's there resting peacefully. And that's Tib.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Impeccable timing. That was exactly 5 minutes. So now Steph is going to present us Mary Vallance and then Frances Pickford.
All right. Well, let's go to the next slide and learn about Miss Vallance. So Mary Vallance was baptized in Sittingbourne, Kent on April 19th, 1790, daughter of William Vallance and Mary Ann Beckett. Her father was a brewer, apparently one serving very bad beer, according to a coachman Anne asked in 1824. But Anne first became aware of Miss Vallance when she received a note about the death of Emily Norcliffe, which Chantal mentioned, Isabella's younger sister. So Emily died while the family was in Brussels, which is where she had met and become close with Miss Vallance. Mrs. Norcliffe had begged Anne to write and inform her, which she did, and the two struck up a correspondence, with Anne feeling it a melancholy pleasure to pay any attention in my power to one who, whoever or whatever she may be, has a claim upon me on behalf of poor Mim. Next slide. When the Norcliffe family returned to England, Anne and Miss Vallance finally met in person while staying at Langton Hall. Anne was agreeably surprised with Miss Vallance, having received a less than favorable review about what to expect of her from Mariana. According to Anne, she studied thorough bass and played music scientifically and pleasantly, perhaps well, and gave Mary Best's children, then 10-year-old Rosamond and 9-year-old Mary Ellen Best's lessons every morning. While the two were at Langton in 1818 after Emily's death, and later 1820 after Mr. Norcliffe's death, Anne learned about Miss Vallance's former lovers, including a Dr. Oburn, who she didn't accept because he was too violent, and Captain Thomas Harnett, who turned out to be such a scamp they could not marry, and was actually later executed for forgery. When she met Anne, Mary was engaged to Andrew Schalch, but Anne learned that Miss Vallance had an intimate relationship with Isabella and found out exactly how close she had been with Emily Norcliffe. It seems Emily wished to do to her as Tib has since made her do. Next slide. And as we've learned, Emily wasn't the only one infatuated with Miss Vallance. Isabella also confessed feeling very strong feelings for her to Anne. And Anne fancied Tib wanted to play the man to her, but Miss Vallance said it was in fact Tib who wanted Miss V to do to her as I had done to Miss V, meaning to grapple her. You can see with that excerpt here that Tib also told Anne Miss Vallance was the only one aside from herself she thought she could love. Next slide, please. Although Mary Vallance was engaged to Andrew Schalch and had been grubbling Isabella, her relationship with Anne also became sexual in 1818. And at the end of that stay, Anne gave her a copy of the alphabet I invented for Mariana and me to use. When they returned to Langton in 1820, they resumed their relationship, and Anne began to talk to her about coming to stay with her at Shibden if she didn't marry. However, Miss Vallance was aware that Tib had always said she planned to go and live with Anne, and could not bear the thought of seeming a rival, knowing as she did our situation towards each other. Yet the two discussed her coming to stay at Shibden anyway as Anne's mistress, if Tib was there with her, and if Miss Vallance didn't marry Andrew Schalch. And next slide. Anne gave her, again, a copy of the crypt hand alphabet at the end of 1820. Perhaps she wasn't really using it the first time. And the two continued correspondence. However, Anne had already begun to feel a little lukewarm about her by that time. In 1824, Miss Vallance, now determined never to marry, and was writing about coming to Anne on her own terms, being everything your wishes would require, and longing to meet with her on the road or back at Langton. Anne contemplated meeting her at Doncaster, but having been affected with her venereal complaint at the time, feared infecting her and noted it would be rascally to do so. Miss Vallance was also trying to suss out Anne's situation because at Langton, Anne alluded to being engaged, letting her think it was Tib or Eliza Raine, but really thinking of Mariana, of course. And next slide. So through October 1825, Miss Vallance was writing letters acknowledging being aware of Anne's circumstances, though hers had changed. However, Anne left a letter of hers unanswered after that, and she seemed to accept that things were at an end, and in another letter assured Anne that if they met again, it would only be with warm remembrances of the past, and asked her not to refuse her the consolation of sometimes writing to and hearing from her. Anne wasn't too sure what to make of the letter, but things were good again with Mariana, evidenced by the venereal complaint, and saw that there should be no stumbling blocks in letting things end with Miss Vallance. By March 1826, Miss Vallance confided in Anne of her re-engagement to Andrew Schalch, which she wouldn't even tell Isabella. Anne returned this letter, apologizing for her previous neglect, but now saying nothing that can be construed into asking or wishing her to write again. By May, another letter announced her marriage, and she wrote to Anne that she will be very glad to see me if I go that way, can at any rate promise me a hearty welcome, to which Anne responded with her best compliments and best congratulations. On June 12th, 1826, Miss Vallance did marry Andrew Schalch, and the census records for 1841, 51, and 71 all show them living alone with just servants. So it's unclear if they ever had children, but that might not have been possible given some of the medical issues she discussed with Anne at Langton, if you've read any of those transcripts. So Andrew died January 13th, 1874, and Mary followed a year later in October 1875. I also have Miss Pickford, so I'll just jump straight into that one. Anne and Miss Pickford didn't have an intimate relationship like some of the others on this list, but Anne was aware of her interest in women, and Pick suspected Anne's, and they also seem to have a lot in common, so she fascinates me, and I wanted to add her in today. Frances Pickford was born at Royton Hall in April 1778 and baptized on the 24th, daughter of Elizabeth Sunderland and Joseph Pickford. Elizabeth was the sole heiress to her father's fortune, and when she passed away in 1796, she may have provided then 18-year-old Frances with the wealth she later used to live an independent life. 1 year prior, her father inherited Marsden and Milnesbridge estates and the surname of his uncle, William Radcliffe, and later became a baronet. The family had some Somerset connections, and a John Pickford owned a house in Sion Hill in Bath, which is where Anne Lister first recorded meeting Miss Pickford in 1813. Next slide. However, it wasn't until Frank, or Pick, as she's also referred to in the journal, was staying with her elder sister Hannah, Mrs. William Wilcox, at Savile Hill in Halifax, that Frances and Anne became better acquainted and attended lectures together. Anne thought she dressed too masculine, wearing a plain short-waisted brown habit and hat rather than bonnet and gown, and used Pick as an example of not being attracted to learned ladies, as they were not the sweet, interesting creatures I should love. She did, however, seem to appreciate how clever her friend was. She thought she was quite sensible and a godsend of a companion in her present society. But she still claimed Pick was too blue, or a blue stocking, and was probably not too keen on being closely associated with her. Emma Saltmarsh and Miss Brown had told Anne about comparisons people of Halifax were making between the two, and Anne didn't seem very pleased about it. Next slide. Like Anne, Miss Pickford was familiar with the classics, Juvenal's Sixth Satire, and a fan of Lord Byron's poetry. She confessed to Anne about having dressed as a soldier and flirting with a woman who thought her the most agreeable of men. While she couldn't get Anne to admit knowing anything of Sapphism beyond theory, she did confide in her about her own relationship with a Miss Threlfall. In fact, Miss Threlfall had been involved in some financial trouble with property of hers in West India, and Frances lent her at least £3,000, which is about $384,000 today, to save her from jail. She told Anne that she had security of Miss Threlfall's property, but merely to protect it from other people, and that she herself was financially comfortable without what she advanced. But Anne still advised her to take possession of the property and pay herself back, along with other creditors, saying it was in Miss Threlfall's interest as much as hers, for it would put more power in Miss Pickford to support her friend in the rank of a gentlewoman. So Miss Threlfall died in 1832, and Anne later noted that Miss Pickford had lost pretty well by her, indicating perhaps she was never repaid. Once Frances left Halifax, she and Anne continued their correspondence. Pick would send Anne interesting books like an Arminian grammar, and Anne would answer all of Pick's scientific questions about naphtha, the difference between the human eye and the eye of a fish, principle of the French inkstands, why the inequality of motion of the sand in an hourglass, etc. Anne was unable to help herself from smiling as she adjusted her own writing to suit Pick's usual pithy style of everything necessary contained in less than one page of a half-sheet note. While Anne was in Paris and Miss Pickford in Switzerland in 1830, Pick wrote asking for a lister job, which was a phrase Anne really disliked, asking Anne to send her anatomy projects or pass along any Galignani after she finished reading it, if you had nothing better to do with it. Anne asked Frances to keep a journal while she was traveling, and let her see it. And Pick did write to her about her tour of Italy with Miss Maitland, who Anne hoped she was in good hands with. Although you can tell from Pick's description of the Rhine, these thoughts were probably just as short and pithy as her other writing, so I'm not sure if that's exactly what Anne was looking for. Like Anne, she noted the temperature at various times of the day and would even write to Anne to compare the temperature with where she was. And in 1834, while in Paris with Anne Walker on their honeymoon, Anne stopped to visit Frances, who was there again with Miss Maitland, and so she finally met Miss Maitland in person. During the rest of the 1830s, Miss Pickford was living comfortably in Bath at Tilehurst, where she is also recorded living in 1841, 51, and the 1861 census with 3 or 4 servants. She's listed in those as a fund holder and owned plenty of property, acted as a moneylender and building spectator in Bath and Bristol, and became—
Sorry, Steph, we're going to have to wrap it up to get on to the next.
Got it. If you have more questions about Miss Pickford, find me later.
Thank you so much. And now on to Sibella Maclean with Amanda Price.
Hello, I'd like to introduce you to Sibella Maclean, and before we get started on the slides, I would just like to point out that the swatch that I've included on this slide is actually the Maclean tartan, because Sibella was from Scotland. And a nice note to add is that when Anne climbed Mount Vignemale in 1838, she actually took her Sibella tartan cloak with her. It's maybe a memorial to her friend. Next slide. So Sibella Maclean was actually born Isabella Jean Maclean. Her date of birth currently is unconfirmed. It's something that we're still investigating, but we think that she was roughly born in 1795. We know that she was slightly older than Anne, possibly 6 years, but it is something that we're still looking for with a birth record. She lived most of her life in Quainish in Mull, which is in the Inner Hebrides in Scotland. She was one of 7 siblings. We think she was the 3rd oldest of all of her siblings. And a fun fact is that she was aunt to Vere Hobart, who we'll hear a little bit more about later on. And she was also related to Anne Walker via the Lloyd family in York through marriage. Next slide. So Anne and Sibella met for the first time in 1820 in York, and it was through friends of Anne's, the Belcombes and the Norcliffes. And we think that they met at a party, another ongoing project with Sibella Maclean. There's lots to uncover, and we're looking to do a lot more research into Sibella, but we think that that's what happened in 1820, that Anne was introduced to Sibella and some of her sisters at a party in one of these houses. Oh, no, go back. The quote in a letter here from 1825 talks about, is something that Anne said, Sibella said to Anne in a letter, I shall expect to see a Yorkshire road maker appear in the shape of my friend in Quainish. It's something that Sibella noted about Anne and sort of commented on her masculine pursuits. Anne was always working on the land, as we know, and making changes to Shibden Hall. And I think this is something that possibly Sibella found very curious about Anne, and didn't really understand why Anne was involved in that behaviour. After they met in 1820, they developed a correspondence that went on until Sibella later died. And oftentimes the letters from Anne were quite romantic, really, and flattering, and I'm sure this was very confusing for Sibella. Next slide. So the relationship with Sibella really took off in 1828 when Sibella invited Anne to come on a tour of Scotland. And obviously Anne loved a tour, and she loved to travel. So she went there. They travelled extensively throughout Scotland. They covered over 2,000 miles using steamboats, carriages, carts, staying in inns and hotels. And they went from Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee. And Anne even managed to get in a quick climb of Ben Nevis, because why not? If you're there, why not? It was during this trip with Sibella that their relationship really moved from just a correspondence and a friendship into a more sexual relationship. And the seduction had really started in their letter correspondence. But I think Anne was very keen to sort of move things forward. She'd always been very complimentary of Sibella, and like I said, romantic in her language that she used in her letters. So there was much grubbling, and there were many kisses had on this trip to Scotland. But unfortunately, Anne did pass on her venereal complaint to Sibella during that trip, which was very unfortunate, and Anne felt very sorry for it. It's remarkable how open Anne was with Sibella. She really confided in her. She obviously valued the friendship a great deal. And she even talked about previous relationships that she had had with Em, with Tib, with Mary Vallance, who we just heard about. And even her scrape, as Anne referred to it, with Maria Barlow, who we'll hear about next. She even shared the extent of her treatment that she had received in Paris for her venereal disease. She confided a great deal, so the relationship was obviously quite important to her. They ended their Scotland tour at Sibella's family home, which was in the Isle of Mull. And Anne flattered and got on incredibly well with Sibella's family. And also...
So sorry, Amanda, we're out of time, and
okay,
I just want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak.
Sure. Thank you.
Sorry. Or if you want to wrap it up in 5 seconds, but...
No, it's fine. It's okay.
Sorry. So now on to Maria Barlow with Helena.
Hello. Wow, I've really been impressed with the slides. I haven't prepared them so efficiently as you people, but I'm sure something's been done for me. As we see, Maria Barlow was a widow when Anne met her in Paris. And she, as it says there, married to Frederick Barlow. He was killed at Salamanca in July 1812. When Anne met her at the hotel of Madame de Boive, she was there in Paris with her 12-year-old daughter Jane. She had gone to Paris to get the girl educated, I believe. When Anne arrived there, she was immediately struck by at least 3 of the women in the hotel, and thought Madame de Boive, Mademoiselle de Sens, or Maria Barlow could be likely candidates for her attention, shall we say. We're looking at that. Mrs. B put me out of patience. Jane said I needed not to be so quick. So Jane wasn't very pleased when Anne and Maria Barlow got together, as it were. There was something about Maria Barlow that was a little, I don't know, odd. She had designs on Anne, I felt, right from the beginning. She was the first one to initiate the fact that 2 women could have sex together, for instance. When they were walking in the Pavilion Gardens, she would say Marie Antoinette had the reputation of being fond of women. And by various means of ways she initiated, she ingratiated, should I say, her way into Anne's affections. And Anne began to realise that there could be an affair going on there. There were complications. Maria Barlow had 2 male suitors, a Mr. Bell and a Mr. Hancock, and Anne was perturbed by this. But they were about 3 months at Madame de Boive's establishment until after Christmas. And then in the January, of 1825 and persuaded Mrs. Barlow to set up her own establishment at 15 Quai Voltaire. And that's when the relationship between them became, if you like, extremely sexual, and they slept together most of the time. But all the time that they had together, Maria Barlow was constantly nagging at Anne about her relationship with Mariana. And the locket around Anne's neck, which held some of Mariana's hair, pubic hair, I might say, she was very jealous of it, and she couldn't get over the fact that she knew that Mariana was Anne's first love. Anne, once it got settled at Quai Voltaire, became doubtful. She, if you like, she'd made the conquest, let's say, and now the interest was dwindling, and she knew that she had to return back to England. And this morals broke Maria Barlow's heart, really, because she knew she was going back to Mariana. They did later, around about 1828, go on a trip together, and Maria Barlow was so jealous that she ripped off Anne's neck the locket that kept the hair. Once Anne left Maria in 1825, she decided to go and suss out Mr. Hancock, one of Maria's suitors, if you like, and she actually went to his home and met his mother. She pretended that she was a servant, but really she was checking out what sort of is Maria getting entangled with. And of course, she felt that it was no good trying to carry on a relationship with Maria, because after all, what did they do with Jane? And she had no people in higher ranks, so I'm afraid that the affair was broken off, and Maria Barlow, in fact, really ended it when Anne realised that she womanized her too much. As she was going home in the carriage from Paris, she thought about the love affair between herself and Maria Barlow, and she said, she will not do for me. She womanizes me too much.
I'm so sorry, Helena. Bit of cliffhanger, but time's off. Time's up, I'm afraid. Really sorry about this.
Sorry, yes.
So now on to Madame de Rosny, presented by Cat Williams.
Okay, so Madame de Rosny is probably one of the more mysterious characters in Anne's journal. We don't find out too much about her, but what we do find out is quite a bit about the men in her life, which make her much easier to track than you might think. She was born in Valenciennes in 1789 to this guy, Gabriel Hecat, who was a philologist, historian, and lexicographer. And in 1809 married this other guy, Joseph Nicholas de Rosny, who was a libertine and also held a series of very high-ranking jobs, including private secretary to King Louis XVIII of France. Next. Her son was born the following year, and despite Madame de Rosny's desire for him to follow a military path like her husband, as noted in Anne's journal in 1829, he became like his father and became a historian. Joseph de Rosny died in 1814, which left Madame de Rosny a particularly young widow. Next. What we do find out about Madame de Rosny in the journals is she's, as I said, she's quite mysterious, and we know for certain that she was a smuggler. Anne first meets her in 1824, and she is staying with a relative of Jane's Dalton called Miss Gauntlet. Anne first finds out about her smuggling at this time, but that still does not put her off seeking to stay with her later in 1827. What Anne does find during this trip and visit with Madame de Rosny in the spring of 1828 is that she was a Freemason. And apart from the lodges that she notes exist in Valenciennes and Paris, there is not much to find out about this in particular, although there are links between her father, Gabriel Hecat, and Freemasonry. Next. One of the most curious things that appears in the journal is the notion that Madame de Rosny may be a spy. In the November of 1829, Anne notes in her journal that she has told Madame de Rosny that she's heard a rumour, and this rumour originates from May of the same year and comes from Madame Galvani. And Madame Galvani states that this is a rumour that she has heard from Monsieur de la Martignac, who at that time was likely the Prime Minister of France, saying that Madame de Rosny was a spy. And Anne notes in her journal, Madame de Rosny must have some reason for all her partiality to having English at her parties after all the slights she gets from them. Is it because this is part of her government duty as spy upon us all? Next. We lose track of Madame de Rosny after the January of 1830. Her and Anne suffer a fallout between the two of them, and she crops up a couple of times after that, but not in much detail. But what we do know from records is that in 1832, she married the Comte d'Aldemar, and this is a marriage that is encouraged by Anne in the November of 1829, and she advises Madame de Rosny to marry this man, and in thinking about it, is less against it than she used to be. Little is known of Madame de Rosny between then and her death in 1872, but what we do know is that she lived in London for a time, possibly at the similar time to her son Lucien, who lived in London in exile between 1852 and 1860 after the coup d'etat of 1851. Next. She died in 1872 in October, attended by Baron de Macau and the Comtesse Chabrillon. And what we know about the Baron de Macau is he is a relative of her Paris friend from 1828, Comtesse de Falloux. And she was buried in Batignolles Cemetery in 1872 in October, shortly after her death. And if the record is correct, we should be able to find her grave there today. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And now we're going to talk about Vere Hobart, presented by Jane Kendall.
All righty, let's talk about Vere Hobart. On this slide, we have a picture of Vere, obviously not when she was in her late 20s hanging out with Anne Lister in Paris, but if you look closely, you'll see her slight smirk and you'll get the idea. Next slide. We don't know a huge amount about Vere Hobart except what Anne Lister had to say about her, which was actually quite a lot. However, we do know that Vere Catherine Louisa Hobart was born in 1803 in the West Indies, where her father, George Vere Hobart, was serving as the Lieutenant Governor of Grenada before his untimely death shortly prior to Vere's birth. Vere's mother, Janet Maclean, died soon thereafter, leaving Vere orphaned and in the care of her mother's sister, Sibella Maclean, who raised Vere from the age of 11 months on. Old Lady Stuart, mentioned so often in Anne's journals, was Vere's great aunt, and Charles Stuart de Rothsay, an ambassador at the British Embassy in Paris, was Lady Stuart's son. Anne Lister's friend, Lady Elizabeth Stuart de Rothsay, was Charles's wife. Next slide. In April 1829, Vere traveled, accompanied by Anne Lister, to Paris to spend the summer with her relatives, the Stuart de Rothsays. Anne's early impressions of Vere were mixed. In a letter to Sibella, she reported being amused and pleased by Vere's archness, by which she meant her cheeky, playful, somewhat irreverent personality. Anne found Vere interesting and entertaining. However, a number of times she mentioned Vere's intellect rather disparagingly. For example, when Anne and Vere visited the Palais Royal together, Vere herself admitted that she wasn't very intellectual, and Anne endorsed this opinion in her journal. Right, she is not intellectual. Another time, Anne persuaded Vere to let her read the account of a day they had spent together, as recorded in Vere's journal. Later, Anne recorded bluntly in her own journal that Vere had missed a good deal, and in fact, the rest was stupid enough. Nevertheless, before long, Anne became attentive to Vere, and their friendship began to include some mild flirtation as Anne's infatuation grew. The flirting was mutual at first, with Vere adding her fair share of affectionate banter, causing Anne to write multiple times in her journal, "Surely she likes me." On one occasion, Anne recorded in her own inimitable way that Miss Hobart had been certainly rather more than usually flatteringly and markedly attentive, adding, "But she can flirt well, I see." Then, on a weekend jaunt in July 1829, Vere and Anne shared quite an intimate evening. Their trip had gone haywire because of a problem with the carriage, and they'd reached their destination late and exhausted. That night, Anne knelt next to Vere's bed, almost lovemaking, as she expressed it, and telling Vere how she felt about her. Vere started to cry, causing Anne to apologize, saying she hoped she hadn't said anything annoying. Vere responded no, that she liked it. And then she let Anne hold her hand and kiss her several times. Encouraged, Anne told Vere that all she wanted was to have someone with her, and proposed what they later called the 3 ifs. If anything should happen to Lady Stuart, and if anything should happen to Sibella, and if Miss Hobart should not marry, perhaps she would go with Anne to Switzerland. In May 1831, Anne began talking to Vere about spending the winter in Italy. Unfortunately, though, cholera had reached the continent around that time, and the pair ultimately decided instead to get an apartment in Hastings at 15 Pelham Crescent, in hopes that the climate there might improve Vere's worrisome, persistent cough. While in Hastings, Anne began her earnest, and some might say relentless, pursuit of a romantic relationship with Vere. However, while Vere enjoyed the attention she got from Anne, she became increasingly averse to Anne's advances, especially those of a physical nature. Perhaps inadvertently, Vere sent Anne mixed signals, seeming to both encourage her and push her away, and they frequently had what Anne referred to as tiffs about this. Vere deeply hurt Anne's feelings by calling her tiresome and limiting the amount of time Anne was allowed to spend with her. She referred to Anne's feelings for her as being due to some unaccountable folly or an unaccountable frenzy, trivializing Anne's deepest emotions and causing her lasting pain. Things came to a head on a day trip in March 1832 when Anne, in good spirits, got a little bit carried away and kissed Vere's hand, saying it was to console her for the want of something else. Vere reacted badly, calling Anne's behavior terrible and rendering Anne grave and silent for the remainder of the trip. Later, she explained that she wanted Anne to feel the same, but show it differently. She continued that it was a great pity that Anne expected so much and wanted what Vere could not give. Near the end of their time in Hastings, Vere accused Anne of just needing someone to fondle. In the ensuing argument, she said it was unfair of Anne to call her heartless just because she couldn't feel for Anne all that Anne wished. And she went on to say that she might feel it for others, even others less deserving than Anne.
I'm so sorry, Jane. I think time's up.
I almost made it. There are several slides left, and I'll be happy to share them if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards. Thank you, Claire.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you all so much for keeping in time. Just as a reminder, we can continue the conversation on hashtag Analysis Summit, but in the meantime, we have just under 10 minutes left for questions. So I see there's a few questions that have been shared and a few questions that have been shared before the session. So I'm just going to combine 2 of those. So one here by Suzanne: is there anything known about the whereabouts of Mrs. Barlow after Anne? Which links up quite nicely with question received: why did Anne and Maria Barlow stop communicating? So I was wondering if anybody wanted to take that one, or
the question about what happened to Maria Barlow. She did go back to Guernsey, I believe, and remarried there eventually. Apparently, her daughter Jane, as an adult, kept a journal, and the records are there in Guernsey. If anybody would like to chase that one up.
Nice, great, thank you very much. And there was more of a general question as well that was shared before the session, which I found really interesting. Is there anything in Anne's diaries suggest that these women all have their own stories to tell, or what do they teach Anne about herself? Because there's always this idea, I think, that Anne is an exceptional occurrence in these women's lives, but what do they bring to her life? So I was wondering if more of an open-ended question.
Jane, I think you had made some comments about this regarding Vere, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, Anne and Vere, I liked reading about and transcribing the entries about them, because Vere was a person who, although Anne did talk badly about her intellect from time to time, she was quick and she was bright and she was witty, and she could hold her own, definitely hold her own, in a discussion or an argument with Anne Lister. And she had a comeback for every single thing Anne said. As a former lawyer myself, I would hate to have been on the other side of a courtroom from Vere Hobart, because she was quick on her feet and kind of I could relate to her personally because she's a bit of a smartass. If we have time, I could tell you a cute story about Anne and Vere and the seals. So if somebody would like to put a question about the seals in, I'll be happy to tell you about that.
I mean, I want to know about the seals.
Well, here's the thing about
really
the seals.
To know.
Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking. I told you about the 3 ifs and how Anne had said, if this, if that, and if the other thing, we'll go to Switzerland together. Well, Vere then stated the 3 ifs, named it the 3 ifs, and said it in French. And it turns out that the word if in French means a yew tree.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, Anne said, oh, it's 3 yew trees. Let's make a seal for our future correspondence, and we'll have 3 yew trees on it. It'll be great, and we can use it whenever we write to each other from now on. So then this thing about seals became a recurring theme. And when they would fight, Vere would snipe it at Anne by saying, no, instead of the yew trees, let's have this on our seal. And one of the things that she suggested was that the seal should say, noli me tangere, which is a Latin phrase which was supposedly spoken by Jesus to Mary Magdalene when she recognized him after his resurrection. And it means, don't touch me. Which fitting motto given Vere's aversion to Anne's sort of touchy-feely tendencies. Then the whole thing about seals came up one more time. Again, they had had a big fight, and afterwards, it seems that Anne had said, well, if it keeps up like this, I'll just start not caring anymore. And that's right, said Vere, I'll be glad of that. And then you can say, who cares? And then Anne says, well, that's good. I'll make that the motto for our seal. Instead of noli me tangere, we can just have it say, who cares? Well, so then she said, and you will have chosen them both. So a couple days later, when things had calmed down, they weren't really fighting with each other, Vere said to Anne, well, I really do want that seal that says, who cares? And she even knew what she wanted it to look like, who she wanted to make it, and so forth. So Anne writes this down in her journal. She seriously asked me to give her that seal with who cares. So, an Anne and Vere story that kind of illustrates the kind of flippant way they communicated with each other, and why I think one of the reasons I think Anne Lister really liked Vere was because in some ways she was not her equal. Nobody was Anne Lister's equal, but she could hang in there with Anne and make Anne laugh and give her back a taste of her own medicine.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for that seal story, and I love the hashtag in the chat, hashtag seal story. I was wondering if anybody wanted to bounce off on that in terms of women, who were able to hold their own against Anne, and how that appeared in the journals. No. Any other questions from people for this session? Right. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left.
Claire, I can add one more thing.
Okay.
I came across numerous times in my transcriptions about Anne and Vere an Anne Lister word. I think we need hashtag ZAM her. Z-A-M is Anne's way of saying damn, apparently. And at least 3 different times in the short period that I was transcribing, she gets really frosted with things Vere has said and done. And she'll say things in her journal like, in my walk after leaving her, I said perpetually to myself, zam her. Or later, Anne likes to think that, Vere has rejected me now, but later on she'll wish she had me back. She's writing things like that in her journal all the time. Now said I to myself that I can be cheerful and seem likely to get over it. Perhaps when she did not expect it, she will come around and all she'll get is zam her.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really brilliant way. Unfortunately, our time is up, but that's a brilliant way of ending the session, I think, but all about these amazing women. It's very, very short and snappy per session, but we'll have the chance to share the session afterwards and continue discussion onto the hashtag Anne Lister Research Summit. Next up is a session that's all about Anne Walker. So she has a whole session to herself coming up next in 10 minutes. And then finally, you can also continue this discussion at the peak party that we're having later on at 9 p.m. British time. So a great opportunity to talk more about these amazing women and kind of discuss a bit more behind these amazing 5-minute teasers. So thank you so much to the speakers and everybody who joined us today.